everyone. We'll go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining us. This is PAVE's 125th virtual panel. Um, I've heard a lot of people across the AV space say that the biggest challenge in making AVs really scalable and widespread is not figuring out the technology, but figuring out the regulations and the regulatory landscape and laws. And this year we have a new administration, a new Congress, lots of changes across state governments. So we wanted to have a conversation about what that means and what the future looks like in 2025. And we have two of the biggest rock stars and most knowledgeable people I can possibly imagine for this conversation. Hilary Cain from the Alliance for Automotive Innovation and Finch Fulton from K&L Gates. Thank you both so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
You both have really extensive backgrounds both in the public and private sectors. Really want to start just if you could each give a quick introduction of your background and what you're doing right now in the space. Hillary, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, sure. So, as you said, I'm Senior Vice President of Policy at the Alliance for Automotive Innovation. We are the leading trade association for the auto industry here in the US. So we represent automakers, but also automotive suppliers and technology companies that are working in the automotive space. Before I took over this role as the head of policy, I have spent about 12 years working on automotive technology policy specifically, both here at the association and at Toyota. And then before that, I spent a decade doing technology policy in the House of Representatives.
Great, thank
And
you.
I started my career in the House and Senate. I was on the 2016 transition team for President Trump's first go round. I was at the U.S. Department of Transportation all 4 years. I was the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy and then nominated to be Assistant Secretary under Secretary Chow. And I had the innovation portfolio. So I went deep and wide on automated vehicle issues, guidance, regulatory updates, and the like. And then afterwards, I went to a autonomous trucking startup that died about 2 years ago. So I've been at K&L Gates as a government affairs advisor for the last 2 years. So thank you for having me.
Thank you. And importantly, they are both PAVE board members. Um, Helen, I'll get started with you. Before we start looking at future changes on the AV landscape, I think it'd be helpful to talk for a minute about where we are. Can you just give us an overview of the status quo and both what the state's roles are and what US DOT has done on the AV front?
Yeah, sure. And maybe I'll start with federal. The US DOT has sort of, I would say, gotten involved in AV policy and sort of fits and starts over the last 8, 9 years. In the first Trump administration, we saw quite a bit of work around federal automated vehicle policy. For example, there was some work to update existing motor vehicle safety standards that currently are a barrier to deployment of AVs, particularly those that have sort of non-conventional vehicle designs. And a lot of that work, unfortunately, sort of paused over the last 4 years. But in the waning days of the last administration, we did see AV STEP, NPRM came out, which is a pathway to deployment, commercialization of AVs, a proposal to do that using some different exemption authority that the Department of Transportation has. So that's kind of where we've been over the last 8, 9 years in terms of US DOT. And then the states, I mean, it is, I think what we would all agree is that the states have been seeking to fill a void. I think what they have perceived to be a void in terms of federal regulatory action in this space. And so we've seen, states take different approaches. We've seen a lot of states sort of implement permitting programs for testing and deployment, approval. You have to, seek approval in order to test or deploy. We've seen states put operational requirements in place for AV operation. And most recently, we've seen a rather significant uptick in data reporting requirements out of the states. But that's basically a snapshot. I don't know, Finch, if you want to jump in and add anything, but that's sort of how I see the federal and state landscape right now.
Yeah, no, I think that's about right. Thinking about AV STEP in particular, it was a program that was announced the year before last in San Diego at ARTS at an automated vehicle conference. It did finally come out, and I know that there were some partners that were interested in the exemption process. It does look at expanding slightly what would be considered through an exemption process, specifically make inoperative requirements. So today you can put a vehicle on the road that has all of the standard equipment, and you can add automated vehicle components to it. But right now you wouldn't be able to go through a normal process to be able to remove the steering wheel, the pedals, and the like. So that's why you see like a Waymo on the road that still has all of the conventional controls. Now, what we've seen is through interpretations built upon AV 3.0 and also um, previous exemptions, like the one that was granted to Neuro to be able to deploy non-conventional vehicles, we have seen purpose-built vehicles use the interpretation process and self-certify to the FMVSS. So there is still a question over, is this the right vehicle to be able to to be able to gather information to inform future permanent rulemakings like the AV safety framework, which was envisioned, first put out under Secretary Chow, and it was actually very early 2021, but also could inform things like the FMCSA ADS-equipped automated driving system or autonomous trucking rule. So essentially, you have the big issues, the NHTSA AV safety framework and the FMCSA rule specifically for the other parts of ensuring the safety of the operations of an autonomous truck outside of the vehicle equipment itself. Not lost in all of this is the FMCSA's denial of the exemption petition to use warning markers for autonomous trucks. This was submitted nearly 2 years ago, and then on Christmas, they came out with the denial, which upset many people. Why, if you're going to deny it, why wait 2 years? Certainly, they put in requests for additional information, but you could grant that and still pull in the additional information to inform future rulemakings. Now, that issue has been challenged in court. We will see what happens. But certainly, if you talk about the biggest actions the previous administration took, that denial is massive. And what it means for industry, it's hard to overstate. So as we look at this incoming still administration, because there's still people being nominated and confirmed, that's going to be an issue that they have to wrangle with. Whether or not the courts handle it, essentially determining the path forward for autonomous trucks, that's going to set the field for all autonomous vehicles in some way or the other. So really the biggest issues are the exemption petition, the NHTSA safety framework, which again, safety advocates were surprised at how strong Secretary Chow's proposal was, and then the FMCSA rulemakings for autonomous trucks as a whole.
And Finch, you talked about this a little bit. I just want to drill down for a second on AV STEP. So obviously NHTSA put out the proposed rule in December, as we talked about. The question we keep hearing from people is whether this administration is likely to keep along that path or kind of do their own thing. How similar is this to what the Trump administration had looked at the last time, and where do you see that going?
The big question is, how necessary is it? Because you can use the tools that you have today to grant exemptions. There's a question as to whether or not it truly is using new authorities to allow different sort of exemptions to be put forward. But I think many question whether or not it's necessary. Now, certainly some of the voluntary data submissions that you can do are new. And I've heard people claim that it's not dissimilar from how Secretary Chow under Trump 1.0 did the voluntary safety self-assessments, which nearly every player publishes how they address the 12 safety critical areas for the deployment and testing of an autonomous vehicle, as well as the AV test program, which is where people would submit information about where they're testing and where they're looking to deploy their systems. So this is considered by some a logical progression there, but by others, the amount of data that's being requested is far and away at a higher level than was considered by VSSAs or AV tests. And the question is it going to be worth their time and worth their while to put forward this information absent any sort of regulatory relief or clarity on the path forward? I think you're going to have to combine this with other programs for industry to really be excited about it. And ultimately, you're going to have clarity on the overall path forward. I will say, I do think that they'll leave the comment period open, and it's probably a good idea to submit comments. Even if your comments are, thanks for doing this, put more of your attention on the AV safety framework or the FMCSA proposals. It's still good to submit your information and to provide that feedback to FMCSA and NHTSA and DOT as a whole.
Yeah, if I could jump in on this, I mean, this idea of creating a pilot or demonstration program isn't new, right? This first surfaced years and years ago under the first Trump administration. And I do think there's a question about whether it's, time has come and gone. I mean, and I don't know the answer to that, right? But I will say that we, at least, the auto industry was a strong proponent of this idea in the early days. And the reason for it was sort of twofold, right? One was, until the existing motor vehicle safety standards are updated, your only pathway to commercialization of a non-conventionally designed autonomous vehicle was through the exemption process. And that exemption process was onerous, and the exemption process was capped, legislatively capped. There was only a certain number of vehicles, 2,500 vehicles for 2 years, that you could deploy using that exemption authority. And so there was, at the time, some thinking that there could be, as a bridge, between where we are, where we were then, and sort of finalized, updated motor vehicle safety standards, the value of some sort of uncapped exemption pathway. Regardless of whether there is still value in that or not, I think it's an open question, and it really depends on how quickly this new administration can complete the regulatory barriers work that's been paused for the last number of years, because we really ultimately need to see the motor vehicle safety standards updated. That's the holy grail. That's what we really need.
For sure. Actually, Hillary, one other question to switch branches of government. There's been a lot of speculation that we could see an AV bill in Congress this year. And I'm going to kind of throw a couple of questions at you. How likely do you think that is, and what does that look like? And then a different question from your professional hat: what would the industry like to see in a bill?
Yeah, so I refuse to guess on the likelihood of Congress passing an AV bill, because it's one of those things that keeps slipping through our fingers, and has for a long, many years now. That being said, I mean, this is not my association speaking. This is me speaking. I also wonder if a federal AV bill, the need for that has come and gone. I mean, there were basically 3 things that a federal AV bill was trying to achieve. One was directed rulemaking. One was telling NHTSA to do all of these rulemakings that we've just been talking about. The second was to raise that exemption cap I just talked about, right? So I told you that the traditional exemption program is capped statutorily. So in order for it to not be capped, Congress would need to act. So that was another thing a federal AV bill was going to do. Whether you need that now with an AV STEP program or not, I don't know. And then the third was preemption, right? Was clarifying federal and state roles, which is also something that NHTSA can do on its own if it enacts new motor vehicle safety standards specific to AVs. So, will Congress do it? I don't know. Do they need to do it? I don't know. But I do know that there's a lot that NHTSA can be doing in the coming years that maybe, obviates the need for a federal AV bill at all.
Look, in my youthful, naive days of working in the first Trump administration, I was one of the leading people saying, I don't think we need anything from Congress. We have all the authorities we need to move forward on all of the regulations for automated vehicles. And then, of course, there was a change in administrations, and there wasn't certainty that DOT wanted to do this anymore. So I'd say this time around, if I could write the bill myself, it would be simple things like NHTSA will finish an AV safety framework rulemaking, and then they will use that as a platform to build out future regulations. FMCSA will finish the rulemaking for autonomous trucks, and it will have the considerations for the exemption petitions. They will formalize the language in AV 3.0 and some of the other interpretations that says you don't have to put in human controls if there's never going to be a human controlling the vehicle. Simple things like that. And then I would stop, right? Like, it'd be nice if you'd be like, just this, Congress, just these little narrow things, just to provide the certainty to industry on these issues that NHTSA, FMCSA, and DOT will move forward with the rulemaking with the blessing of Congress, right? We've seen lots of funding bills, we've seen language, we've seen things that indicate strong support for industry, but just those little bits of clarity, directing DOT in those rulemakings, or to finish those rulemakings, if I had my great wish, it would be just that. But we'll see what Congress does. You know, every Congress springs eternal.
Absolutely. Okay, want to talk a little bit. We started at the top talking a little bit about the states. Obviously, states have a huge role in overseeing AV deployments in their jurisdictions. And Hillary talked a little bit about where we are. Where do you all see that going, in the next year, a couple of years? Finch, do you want to?
I've seen a stat that 13 different states are considering automated vehicle legislation today, some of which are driver-in bills, which, you know, obviously goes against the entire purpose of autonomous vehicles. Assuming best intentions, right? Assuming that everybody wants this industry to succeed, I think the real cause of these issues is the fact that they have not seen the federal government owning these issues for the past few years. And so they feel like they have to do something themselves. If we can give states and cities and localities and even the public something to focus their attention on, a rulemaking that discusses a safety case framework for an FMVSS, what are the requirements industry is going to need to put forward to be able to self-certify that their vehicles are safe. If they have something they can comment on or even bring together work groups in addition to the federal rulemaking process, then they can say, I'm doing what I need to do on behalf of my constituents to ensure their safety. If we don't give them anything to work on, they'll go off on their own and continue these one-off issues where they're trying to regulate something they really shouldn't be, with all sorts of expertise that they don't have, because they just don't see the federal government working the way it's supposed to. So if the federal government can get back to work, that'll get a vehicle for our state and local partners to have their concerns addressed and to be able to show that they're having action on these concerns. Then we can resolve many of the issues just through going through the normal process.
Sure. Hillary, anything to add on that front?
No, I mean, well, okay, how about this? How about what I will say is I think, we are at a very critical time for the AV industry in the United States. It's been too long that the industry has been seeking regulatory clarity. And what's been going on at the state level, this patchwork of state laws, states trying to outdo each other on who's more sort of, I don't know, aggressive towards the technology, is not helping the overall health and competitiveness of the AV industry in the US. And so I do think we're at a sort of critical juncture here for the states to figure out how to link arms with the federal government, with USDOT, and let's figure out how to do this in an organized, comprehensive, and aligned way, so that innovators can innovate and this technology can benefit consumers all across the US.
For sure. Actually, and one other question for you is most AV developers look toward electrification to ensure that technologies are creating a more sustainable transportation system. So wanted to just ask you quickly, Hillary, what changes do you foresee on the EV front, and what is the industry view of that?
Yeah, I mean, here, what we do know is that the new administration is taking a very different approach to electrification than the previous administration did. I think that's to be expected. I think that they are, pretty much everything that the previous administration did on the electrification side, this administration is re-evaluating. And I think in a lot of respects, that's fair. And that's what happens when a new administration comes in. So, whether it's the federal regulations that, govern greenhouse gases and fuel economy standards, whether it's California's authority to do its own zero emission vehicle mandate program, whether it's, the consumer and manufacturing incentives that were put in place in the Inflation Reduction Act, like all of those are being reevaluated, federal funding for EV charging. Some of those are helpful. Some of those are not as helpful, but it's, within their right. And then, I think, like I said, as to be expected, just sort of review the whole landscape and decide. And to answer your question, I don't know how this is all going to shake out. I think, we need to let these folks do what they're going to do and be deliberative and, take a look at things and figure out where to go from here. But I do think it's going to be a different environment going forward, at least in the next few years, than it was over the last 4.
For sure. Finch, obviously there's been a lot of talk about tariffs, and we also got several questions from the audience about that. What impact will this have on the auto industry and automated vehicles in particular?
I feel like Hillary would be better for this question. I'm kidding. Um, so look, there's a saying that I've heard that I really like. Don't take President Trump literally, take him seriously. And so there's a long way between now and April 2nd when the tariff should come in. The main idea behind it, the main theory that I see behind it is with the great hollowing out of our industrial base, right? And all of the free trade agreements leading to a lot of work leaving the country. There's been a real concern with the lack of American manufacturing base so that if we needed to create these vehicles all on our own, we could. And our supply chain is so entangled globally, with China specifically, but elsewhere, that there's a lot of questions whether or not we could do that. So the idea that you can take seriously, if not literally, is that by raising the price of these, you were creating incentives, building upon some of the incentives from the Biden administration and many of the announcements in the first Trump administration to bring that manufacturing back home, right? There's different tactics, different carrots and sticks that we've seen between the previous two administrations, including Trump 1.0. But that's the whole idea. Bring the jobs back to the US, make sure we have the capabilities to stand on our own. Because as we've seen, many of these systems, many even of our critical systems that have to do with national defense, many of our electronics and semiconductor systems, those are also globally tied in with suppliers of concern, foreign entities of concern, that in the unlikely but potential occasion where we would go to war with China, we wouldn't even be able to keep our own defense industrial base going because we wouldn't have access to all of the resources and parts we needed. So we have to be able to stand on our own 2 feet as a nation. This is the theory behind it all, right? There's lots of disagreement with, how to treat friends, how to make sure that you have, global ties so that there would never be a reason why you go to war. But this is the overall theory. And if you look at the great populism bend over the last decade, 15 years, 20 years, this is a key part of it. I mean, all of the backlash against NAFTA in the 90s and all of our global engagements and, what's happening to organized, unionized jobs and the blue collar jobs as a whole. This is, if you look at the difference in how people have lived these past 20 years and their fates and their fortunes, this is what he's looking at addressing. And this is sort of the overall bend of where he's going with all of these things. If he had to choose between a populist answer that addressed blue collar needs and a popular answer that would address CEO and business leader needs, he's going to choose the blue collar answer every time. And I think we're seeing that in impacting companies around the world today.
I can jump in a little bit on the AV side specifically. I think you've seen AVs and tariffs sort of play out in a couple, or I guess there's implications for AVs in sort of a couple spaces. One is there has been concern expressed by policymakers, and not specific to the Trump administration, just policymakers in general, about Chinese AV developers testing or deploying on US roads, and whether there's surveillance happening and things like that. And so I think there has been, whether it's through tariff policy or other trade policies, some general interest in maybe limiting or preventing Chinese companies that have some sort of connection to the Chinese Communist Party to be testing and deploying AVs in this country. That's one. The second place you've seen this play out a little bit with tariff and trade policy is on the component side, and in particular with LiDAR, which is an essential, I think still considered an essential part of AVs. And there are a lot of, not a lot, there's a fair I think a fair portion of the industry is using or relying on some pretty competitive Chinese suppliers in that space. And so there's trade and tariffs and what that means for autos and what that means for products generally. But those are two, I just thought I'd flag two areas where I've seen sort of an intersection between trade and tariff policy, and AVs specifically is on LiDAR, and then Chinese developers testing and deploying in the US.
Yeah, great point. We also got a lot of great questions from the audience that people sent in when they registered. We have a few minutes left, so I wanted to just kind of hit on a few of these. One question, and I want to sort of preface it with what PAVE says in everything we do. There are no autonomous vehicles for sale to the public today. There are cities in which you can take a ride in a fully autonomous car, but no car available for consumer purchase is fully autonomous, and every car requires an attentive driver behind the wheel. Having said my critical boilerplate, someone is asking what the differences we expect in regulation between personally owned automated vehicles relative to fleets. Do either of you have a comment on where you see that going?
I think the biggest issue is going to be the maintenance of the systems, sensors, and making sure everything is up to date, clean, and in working condition. You know, when you look at the difference between how FAA regulates planes and how NHTSA regulates vehicles, the FAA controls who is allowed to operate the plane, who's allowed to maintain the plane, how they do it, where they can do it, every step of the process from beginning to end. NHTSA has the authority to set standards for new vehicles. So when you're talking about fleet operations, they can control many vehicles, and they obviously bring in experts, and they can do adjustments every night, keep everything clean. If something happens, they can take care of it immediately. In an individually owned vehicle, there's still a question of who would take care of that. And do you have to train the individual to make sure that they can keep all the sensors clean and in working condition? And how often do they have to go to the dealer to get things calibrated and set correctly? So there is still a bit of a question, in part because we haven't seen those deployments. We're seeing fleet deployments with Zoox and Waymo and the like, but you don't see that on the individual level. So there will still be a question over how that is done. And then, of course, questions about how much are you putting on the individual who owns and operates that vehicle, and should it get into a crash while it's operating autonomously, the question over how is it maintained, how is it calibrated, was it done by the book, and was there reasonable expectations put on the individual riding in that vehicle that was operating on its own. Some of that will be a logical progression that will be shown in the safety case for how should we get an AV safety framework, and should it follow the safety case approach that has been discussed. You would be able to highlight, where in the system the expectations are, and is it reasonable to assume that individual would have those responsibilities in the training and have what they need to make sure that they can follow through on that. So still many questions to be determined in the future. Some can be handled regulatorily. Some will have to be worked out through different agreements and the proposals that people put forth for the individual ownership of a, let's say, level 4 autonomous vehicle.
Yeah, so I'm going to jump in and say I love this question from the audience, and I'm happy they asked it, because it is something that we are raising for policymakers, because we do have a couple of our automaker members who have announced plans to deploy level 3 vehicles in the United States. And those would be vehicles that would be personally owned. You would go to a dealership and you would buy one of those, and it would sit in your driveway just like any other vehicle that you have today, and only you would drive it. And the problem we're seeing is a lot of policymakers don't have an understanding or appreciation that there is this flavor of autonomous vehicles. They are assuming that all autonomous vehicles will be owned and managed and run by fleets. And so, for example, right now in Pennsylvania, it is illegal to have a personally owned AV, which means level 3 vehicles cannot be sold in Pennsylvania, which is a problem. So it is, I do think it's something that as we get into this new world where we are going to see lots of different flavors and lots of different varieties of autonomous vehicles, it's going to be complicated. I think we have to acknowledge it's going to be complicated, but B, it is not a one size fits all approach. And there is going to be, I think, need to be some nuance among policymakers and how they treat, like I said, a level 3 personally owned vehicle versus a level 4 or 5 fleet owned and operated vehicle. And maybe I'll just add, like, data is a big one, right? I talked earlier about how we're seeing states put these data requirements in place. Data collection from a fleet owned AV, that's one thing. Data collection from a vehicle that Finch owns, that it drives, as like, that's a whole different level of privacy consideration. Anyway, just it gets complicated, but something that we need to be thinking about.
And actually, that's a conversation we should do for another day, which would be another fantastic discussion with you guys. But sadly, we are at time. Wish we could go on forever. This is a great conversation. Thank you to Hilary Cain and Finch Fulton for joining us, and thank you to the audience for joining us this afternoon. You can find a recording of this at pavecampaign.org, and hope to see you all next time. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.